Hey guys, so we are more than halfway to your first exam, which is exciting, and this chapter is on consciousness, which is a pretty fun topic. Alright, so we talked about cognitive neuroscience being that discipline where you're linking brain activity with cognition, activities of the mind, perception, thinking, memory, and language, and that's really what this chapter sort of focuses on. So the first things that we want to distinguish between are selective attention, inattentional blindness, and change blindness, and then blind sight as well, which is not quite as similar to these three. But recognize that these also make excellent multiple choice questions because there are 4 of them and 4 multiple choice answers. So starting with selective attention, what I want you to write down next to this one is selective attention is tuning something out. Tuning something out. So, when you decide to focus on what your professor is saying in the classroom, for example, you might have to tune out some other noises like sound of air coming through a vent, the sound of lights buzzing, the sound of other students writing on their papers, for example. And so that is selective attention. It's just tuning out the unimportant stuff so that you can really focus in selectively and pay attention to whatever is most relevant. So selective attention is tuning something out. Write that down. Next to inattentional blindness, I want you to write down distraction. Inattentional blindness, distraction. And so inattentional blindness occurs when you have your attention directed somewhere else and something visible happens in front of you, but you just fail to notice it because you are distracted by whatever it is that you're selectively attending to. And so one kind of real life example of this was there was a basketball game being played, and one of the members of the team actually had a knife and stabbed one of the other players. But because the ball was elsewhere, the whole crowd failed to see this person get stabbed because they were focusing on where the ball was. They weren't expecting to have to pay attention to something else. And so even though it happened in front of a crowd of, hundreds of people, absolutely nobody saw it happen because they were distracted, and that is inattentional blindness. So selective attention, you are deciding what to pay attention to, but inattentional blindness, you don't mean to, but you fail to pay attention to something. Inattention. And then change blindness is when something in the environment around you changes and you don't notice it. So, for example, if you were at some kind of performance and the curtain was red at the start of the play and lifted up, and then at the end of the play, the curtain that came down was blue, and you just thought, oh, it was always blue, that would be change blindness. Something changed in your environment and you failed to see it. The example that the textbook gives talks about someone asking someone else for directions, and then when the person that they've asked turns away to sort of point, oh, you go this way, take a left, whatever, right? The person who asked for directions switches places with someone else, and most of the time the person who's giving the directions doesn't even notice that the person they're talking to now is not the same person they were talking to. So something changes around you and you just fail to notice that it did change. So notice that the 2 terms that have blindness in them have to do with failing to notice something, failing to see something. And then blind sight. This is really interesting. Blind sight is a condition where the part of the brain that consciously recognizes objects is broken. And so for all intents and purposes, when you ask a person if they can see something or you ask them to describe what it is that they're holding or something like that, they can't do it. Their brain doesn't make that connection in understanding or perceiving what something is, but their bodies can actually still respond to them in some ways. So if you ask them to hold out their hands at the exact length of the object, they can do it. If you give them a piece of mail and you ask them to put it into a slot, they do it perfectly. And so they aren't actually blind, but the part of their brain that consciously recognizes objects is broken, so they feel like they're blind, but really they do have sight. It's kind of a weird phenomenon. But it's possible because, the part of the brain that actually processes visual stimuli and the part of the brain that consciously recognizes stimuli are two separate working mechanisms. And so one can be broken while the other is not. And that's how we get conditions like blind sight. Okay, and then when it comes to dual processing and parallel processing, think of dual processing like duo, right? Two things. And so really dual processing just tells us, hey, anytime we process information, we're processing it on two different levels, a conscious level and an unconscious level. So dual processing is just about those two levels, conscious, unconscious. Whereas parallel processing is this idea that we can process a ton of different aspects, an unlimited number of aspects of a problem all at one time. So I think the best way to explain this is with a photo. So if you're looking at a bird, for example, you might process its motion, its form, its depth, and its color all at the same time, which helps us to kind of integrate this information and come up with the formed idea that, oh, that's a hummingbird because it's moving really fast. Its form is that it's small. You can tell how far away it is from you, depth, and that also tells you something about its size. And then the color of it is, red, so it's a hummingbird. And also, do you know that parallel processing is what we use for well-learned or simple problems, whereas sequential processing is what we need to use in order to solve new or difficult problems. And sequential processing really just means step-by-step processing. So parallel processing is processing that happens simultaneously, all at once. We take in all of these different kinds of information at one time, whereas sequential processing is step-by-step. So sequential processing is what you would use if you were solving a math problem, for example. Oh, the first thing I have to do is distribute, and then the second thing I have to do is combine like terms, and then the third thing, so on. And so sequential processing is for new or difficult problems, but parallel processing is for well-learned, easy, simple stuff. And that's frequently a test question. Okay. What you want to know about your circadian rhythm is that is your general 24-hour cycle. And everything, all of your body rhythms are regulated by that. So your temperature, when you wake, when you go to sleep, and when you feel hungry, anything that happens over the course of a 24-hour period regularly. And so this is the reason why, on the weekends, you may want to sleep in, but you might find yourself waking up at the same time as you would for classes. It's just because your circadian rhythm, your biological rhythm that your body is on, is adjusted to kind of a 24-hour internal clock, if you will. And so you tend to wake up at the same time every day, even if you do choose to go back to sleep. You tend to feel hungry around the same time every day, that sort of stuff. Know that alpha waves are waves that are present when you are awake. So alpha waves have nothing to do with sleep, but delta waves, well, we'll get there. Delta waves are going to be deep sleep waves. So we'll see those happening in NREM 3. So alpha waves, awake, alpha, awake, alpha, awake. But delta, deep sleep, delta, deep sleep. Okay? So what you definitely, absolutely, 100% need to know, like the back of your hand, are these sleep stages. NREM 1, NREM 2, NREM 3, and REM. And again, I bet you know what I'm going to say. These make great multiple choice questions because there are 4 of them and there are 4 answers on the multiple choice exam. Usually, sometimes 5, but most of the time 4. So you definitely need to know what goes on in each stage. So I'm going to tell you, 1 or 2 things to write down specifically next to each of these stages. And that's really the extent of what you need to know. You need to know that they go in approximately this order, but once you get through a full cycle of NREM 1, 2, 3, and REM, then it starts to just bounce all over the place. So it's not like 1, 2, 3, REM, 1, 2, 3, REM, 1, 2, 3, REM. It's like 1, 2, 3, REM, 2, 1, 3, 1, 2, REM, 3, 2, REM. It's random after it goes through all of them at first. But what you really want to know is what happens in each stage. So next to NREM 1, I want you to write down the term hypnagogic sensations. And that's spelled Hypnagogic. Hypnagogic sensations. And also, never mind, nothing else. Hypnagogic sensations. And what hypnagogic sensations are just these hallucinations or sensations that you have while you're falling asleep. So I don't know if you ever, well, probably you've experienced this. While you're starting to drift off to sleep, you might kind of see a scene in your head that sort of resembles a dream, but you haven't been asleep long enough for it to actually be a dream. It's a hallucination. That's a hypnagogic sensation. Or those sensations that you get suddenly where you feel like you're falling or floating or something and you jerk yourself back awake. That's a hypnagogic sensation too. And those are experiences of NREM1. So even though you might get a dreamlike sensation, it's never the case that as soon as you start to fall asleep, you go into REM and have dreams. That doesn't happen. What's actually happening is the hypnagogic sensation or the hallucination, which resembles a dream. Next to NREM2, I want you to just write down sleep spindles. And that is all you have to know about NREM2, is that sleep spindles happen during it. Sleep spindles, you don't even really need to know what they are. They're just bursts of electrical activity in your brain. And they follow a certain pattern that we can identify, and so we've classified them as sleep spindles. But just know that sleep spindles happen in NREM2. That's as much as you need to know. Now, NREM3 is really where most stuff starts to happen here. So next to NREM3, you have to write down deep sleep, delta waves, and sleep disorders. Deep sleep, delta waves, and sleep disorders. And so know that delta waves, like I said earlier, are the waves of your brain when you're in deep sleep. And then REM, what you need to write down next to REM is dreams and sleep paralysis, which we also sometimes call paradoxical sleep. But write down sleep paralysis, Paralysis, sleep paralysis. And so what sleep paralysis is the connection between the CNS and the PNS, so right where your brainstem is, shuts off actually when you get into REM, and so it stops the brainstem from communicating with the rest of your body, which causes you to be paralyzed. And so anytime that you're in REM sleep, anytime that you're dreaming, you are incapable of moving apart from your eyes moving underneath your eyelids. But since the brainstem is at your neck, you can have movement in your neck and above, but anything below your neck is completely paralyzed. And that's why we call it paradoxical sleep. The muscles are relaxed, but the other body systems are active. So obviously your heart and your lungs are still working, but all of your muscles are frozen in place. They're fully relaxed. Okay, so like I said, the brainstem blocks those messages from the motor cortex, which paralyzes the muscles of your body. And then this idea of REM rebound is just that if you deprive yourself of REM sleep, which we can do in a laboratory setting, we can monitor when people fall into NREM 1, 2, 3, and then as soon as they're about to go into REM, or as soon as they start to go into REM, we wake them up and we make them, become awake again, and then go back through those stages 1, 2, 3, and then as soon as they start to reach REM, wake them up again, and we just deprive them of this REM sleep. And if you do that, what we found is the next time that they're able and allowed to go to sleep fully, they will have way more REM sleep than usual. So that's REM rebound, that if you're deprived of REM for some amount of time, either because you pulled an all-nighter or because we woke you up repeatedly in the lab, then the next time you're able to go to sleep and sleep fully, you will have way more REM sleep than you ever do before, or ever did before. So the suprachiasmatic nucleus, this you want to know has to do with the production of melatonin. And so the suprachiasmatic nucleus responds to light. So if it's bright out, then it will tell the pineal gland to not produce melatonin. If it's bright out, we need to stay awake. That's just adaptive. But if it's dark out, then your suprachiasmatic nucleus tells the pineal gland to increase the production of melatonin. And melatonin, more of it, will make you sleepy. Less of it makes you more awake. And so that's why, when it's bright light, less melatonin. We don't want to go to sleep. But if it's dark, then we produce more melatonin to be able to go to sleep. And then just know that the suprachiasmatic nucleus is located in the hypothalamus as well. It regulates our circadian rhythm, basically, because, it's responding to light and dark outside. Okay, so then why do we sleep? You don't need to be super detailed here, but one reason is because it protects us. It's adaptive for us to sleep. That was something that was necessary for our ancestors. When it's dark outside, the scary animals come out, right? And so it was adaptive for humans to find a dark, secluded place and to be sleeping instead of being out, being active at nighttime and exposing yourself to potential predators. That's some evolutionary psych for you. Next reason is because it helps us recuperate. We know that our immune system and brain tissue are repaired during sleep, so are your neurons, and any kind of toxicity or waste is removed from your body while we sleep as well. We do a lot of growing while we sleep too. Sleep helps to restore and rebuild our memories of the day's experiences. And that's because while you're asleep, your hippocampus is really active in moving memories from the hippocampus, into long-term storage. And so that's why we actually recall more information after we sleep on it. I don't know if I was a cheerleader in high school, and so one thing I would always do is practice my cheer dances before bed. And even if I didn't know them all that well before I went to bed, I always found that I knew them much better the morning after. And that's because my hippocampus was consolidating and moving those memories over to long-term storage while I slept. So sleep helps to improve memory. Sleep also feeds creative thinking. Dreams can inspire ideas, but more notably than that, sleep also improves our thinking and learning abilities. And so it's actually easier to solve a difficult problem after you sleep on it. And then lastly, like I said earlier, it supports growth. And so that's because the pituitary gland, which remember is the master gland we talked about in chapter 2, releases a growth hormone that helps with muscle development. Okay. Effects of sleep deprivation. Don't feel like you got to write all of these down. Fatigue. It can predict depression. But actually, REM sleep helps to protect against depression. Difficulty studying, decreased productivity, increased tendency to make mistakes, slowed reaction time, irritability, suppression of immune cells. So it can actually, if you really sleep deprive yourself, that's a great way to end up sick. So don't do that. Do not sleep deprive yourself. Weight gain due to, and we will talk more about these hormones specifically in chapter 11, but just kind of note these right now because they are important. That ghrelin is a hunger arousing hormone. Ghrelin makes you hungry. Leptin is hunger suppressing. So leptin tells you that you're full. And, when we're sleep deprived, we have an increased supply of ghrelin, so we end up being more hungry. And we get a decreased supply of leptin, which means that the hormone coming in to tell us when we're full is suppressed. And so we actually end up eating more as a result of sleep deprivation affecting these levels of hormones. A decreased metabolic rate, so that's decreased metabolism, the rate at which your body processes calories and expends energy. And an increased production of cortisol, which is a stress hormone that stimulates the body to make fat. And then enhanced limbic brain responses to seeing food and decreased cortical responses to resist temptation. So you feel cravings more often and you have less self-control. Okay, sleep disorders. You definitely want to know these, and you've probably heard of these before or know something about them. So, insomnia, sure we've heard of this. It's just recurring difficulties in falling or staying asleep. So it can be either or both. Either you have trouble falling asleep, it takes you, hours just laying there with your eyes closed to even get to sleep, or you fall asleep, relatively easily maybe, but you don't stay asleep. Or it could be both. But insomnia is categorized by either or both of those things. Narcolepsy is sort of the opposite of insomnia. Narcolepsy is uncontrollable sleep attacks. So you just randomly fall asleep at, usually inappropriate times, because we've actually found that narcolepsy is connected to increased levels of emotion. And so if something particularly emotional is happening, that might actually trigger a narcoleptic sleep attack. And so, let's say you just got a promotion at a job, you might just fall asleep. Let's say you're really excited that you're getting married, you might just fall asleep, right? So it tends to be at inappropriate times, because it's whenever your emotion is elevated that can trigger a narcoleptic sleep attack. So crazy. Okay. Now here on your page, I want you to draw a physical line, or, draw one with the shapes in Word or whatever, between narcolepsy and sleep apnea, because all three of these disorders, sleep apnea, night terrors, and sleep talking or sleepwalking, all three of those below the line, happen during NREM3. So when I had you write down next to NREM3, sleep disorders, these are the three sleep disorders I'm talking about. So go ahead and draw a line there and then write down that all of those three happen during NREM3. Okay? So sleep apnea is a sleep disorder where someone stops breathing while they're sleeping, and usually that kind of wakes them up because their body realizes it's not getting oxygen and it's got to wake them up so they can take a breath in. And actually, sleep apnea is usually characterized by just snoring. So if you've ever met someone who's a snorer, it's likely that actually what the problem is underlying that snoring is sleep apnea. Because snoring is sort of this labored breathing, right? And then night terrors. Definitely write down that night terrors are not nightmares. They are not the same thing, because nightmares are dreams. Those happen in REM sleep. Night terrors are not dreams. They happen in NREM3 sleep. NREM3 sleep. And there's no visual accompaniment with a night terror. With a nightmare, that's like a dream, a bad dream. But a night terror, actually, most people who have them don't even remember having them at all. So it's not that they are actually scared of something, but it's just high arousal happening in their brain, which causes them to appear like they're really scared, or to sit up and like scream or something like that. But they actually don't even remember it happening, and it's not that something actually did scare them. But definitely write down that night terrors are not nightmares. They happen in NREM3, not in REM. And then sleep talking and sleepwalking also happens in NREM3 sleep. So what I want you to write down next to sleep talking and sleepwalking is that this does not happen during REM. There's sort of this misconception out there that people who are sleep talking or sleepwalking are acting out their dreams, or, sleep talking, they're like having a conversation with someone in a dream. That is not true. That is completely false. Because like I said, during REM sleep, you have sleep paralysis. And so you can't physically get up and walk around because your muscles are paralyzed during REM sleep. So sleep talking and sleepwalking is an NREM3 activity. Okay. So dreams. Freud, our lovely psychodynamic theorist, psychoanalytic theorist, had this idea of manifest content and latent content. And so manifest content is, this is what he said. Now, we haven't really verified this, but manifest content is just your remembered storyline of a dream. So when you wake up and you say, I had a dream about, such and such, Whatever it is that you can recall about that dream, the storyline is the manifest content. But the latent content is what that dream, according to Freud, again, means. Now, we've never been able to actually reliably determine that certain images in dreams or symbols or something like that actually do have an underlying meaning, but this was just Freud's idea, that the latent content of a dream is the underlying meaning. So, if the manifest content is that you were, standing at the edge of a cliff looking down, right? Freud might say, oh, well, the latent content is that you're afraid of the unknown or something like that, right? So then these dream theories, you do not need to know these like in and out or anything of this sort, but do be able to at least recognize each theory's name and sort of the description that goes with it. So, wish fulfillment theory, Freud's idea, is that we dream in order to satisfy our own wishes. Unfortunately, that doesn't make a ton of sense, because why then would we have nightmares, right? Certainly, we're not wishing for something bad or scary to happen to us. So this is, pretty unverified, I would say. But that's wish fulfillment theory. Information processing theory definitely does have validity, and that's the idea that we're filing away memories. We do know that the hippocampus is super active while we're asleep, and it moves our memories from short-term over to long-term storage. So information processing theory, that it's accommodating our memory or helping with our memory, is something that we do know to be true. But it might not be the only reason why we dream. Third one is physiological function theory. And so this is just the idea, and we do have evidence for this too, that our neural pathways are developed, strengthened, and preserved while we are sleeping. And this kind of feeds into, we'll talk about things like plasticity later on in the semester. But this feeds into that in just that your brain kind of rebuilds connections while you're asleep. And that also is partially what aids in memory consolidation as well. So physiological function, it serves a bodily function to sleep and to develop and preserve these neural pathways. Next one is activation synthesis theory. Activation synthesis theory. This is the most confusing of them, but I will try to kind of just simplify it down. So basically, what we know is that when we are asleep, our brains are super, super active. There is so much activity going on in your brain while you're asleep. And so the idea is that there is just so much activity going on that your brain tries to make sense of all that extra activity by weaving it into a storyline or a dream. And so we're making sense of this neural static, which just means all of this random extra activity and energy within your brain. We're transforming it into something that we can sort of acknowledge and process, which would be a dream. And then lastly, cognitive development theory, that our dreams reflect our cognitive development. And that is true as well. We do see that like children have different dreams, or the content of their dreams is different than adults. And so, as we grow up, as we cognitively develop, our dreams do reflect these new experiences that we gather and our new interests and fears and stuff like that. Okay, moving on to psychoactive drugs. This is the fun part, right? Okay, so depressants reduce your neural activity and slow down your body functions. I want you to write that down. Depressants slow down your body systems. Depressants slow down your body systems. 3 types of depressants that we talk about are alcohol, barbiturates, and opiates. Barbiturates are drugs that depress central nervous system activity. Know that. Barbiturates depress your CNS activity. And they can reduce anxiety, but they do impair memory and judgment. And then opiates depress neural activity. So again, barbiturates depress CNS activity. Opiates depress neural activity, and they can temporarily lessen pain and anxiety. Examples are opium, morphine, and heroin. Okay. Now, stimulants do the opposite of depressants. These are going to excite your neural activity and speed up your body functions. So write that down, that stimulants speed up your body systems. They speed up your body functions. And I always say this just because it helps students remember every year. If you think about, how people who drink a lot of alcohol, we say that they get a beer belly, right? Whereas if you've ever seen someone who's on a stimulant, like, methamphetamine, for example, they are super, super, super skinny. Why? Well, because depressants like alcohol slow down your body functions, including your metabolism. And so depressants actually cause you to gain weight, whereas stimulants speed up your body functions, such as your metabolism. And so it actually burns off calories quicker. Now, that is not me recommending that you use any type of stimulant as a weight loss supplement or diet or anything like that. Okay, there are so many negative effects that stimulants do to your body that it is so not worth, the couple of pounds or whatever that you might lose, or more if you use it more frequently. But you will hurt yourself in the process. Don't do that. That is not advice. This is just a way to remember the two. That if depressants slow down your body systems, that explains beer bellies. And if stimulants speed up your body functions, that explains why, meth heads are so skinny, skin and bones. But they're also, sick in a lot of other ways. They're losing their teeth, they're losing their skin. It's not good, right? So yes, amphetamines are drugs that stimulate neural activity, causing accelerated body functions and energy and mood changes. And a couple of those are methamphetamine and ecstasy, which is also MDMA. And then we've got hallucinogens. And so hallucinogens are these drugs that are going to distort your perceptions and evoke sensory images in the absence of sensory input. And so depressants and stimulants really just affect your body systems. Hallucinogens are going to affect the way that you see, hear, perceive the world around you. Okay, so specific drugs. We know about alcohol, the most popular of all of them. Well, except for maybe nicotine, I suppose. But alcohol is a depressant. It slows down your body systems. And one word that you should definitely associate with alcohol is a disinhibitor. Alcohol is a disinhibitor. Disinhibits. And so if you think about, if something's inhibiting you, it's sort of stopping you from doing something. Alcohol disinhibits. And so if an inhibitor stops you from doing something, a disinhibitor is going to take away that sort of roadblock to doing something, and you're just going to impulsively do whatever you're thinking of doing. Alcohol is also linked to depression, memory loss, organ damage, especially your liver, of course, and impaired reactions, impaired judgment. Mostly because it works to affect your frontal lobe, which we talked about in Chapter 2 as sort of being the center of your planning and judgment decision making. Heroin is a depressant. It can make you feel euphoric, give you a relief from pain, but it depresses your physiology, and there is a really terrible withdrawal associated with heroin. I knew someone that I used to work with, actually, who was a recovering heroin addict, and he used to tell me about how when he was trying to go off of it all on his own, he would get these crazy hot and cold flashes. And he said that he would literally sit in his bathtub with like the shower pouring down the hottest water possible on him, and he would still feel like he was in ice. So the withdrawal from heroin is just horrible. Don't try it. Okay, caffeine. Actually, this is probably the most common of them, honestly. Caffeine is obviously a stimulant. What do we use it for? When we need more energy, right? It promotes alertness and wakefulness, but it can cause anxiety, restlessness, and insomnia in high doses. Nicotine, of course, is a stimulant. It can arouse you, but also relax you, which is sort of interesting, and provide a sense of well-being, but, of course, it's linked to heart disease and cancer. Cocaine is a stimulant, and that gives you a rush of euphoria, confidence, energy, but using cocaine can lead to cardiovascular stress, suspiciousness, and a really depressive crash after the high is gone. Methamphetamine is a stimulant. It can promote euphoria, alertness, and energy, but the downsides are irritability, insomnia, hypertension, and seizures. Very bad. Ecstasy, also known as MDMA, is both a stimulant and a mild hallucinogen. And so what that leads to is emotional elevation, disinhibition, and ultimately can lead to dehydration, overheating. Those two kind of go hand in hand. If you're dehydrated, it's more likely that you'll overheat. Or if you're overheating, you'll likely become dehydrated. Depressed mood, and impaired cognitive and immune functioning. So it actually harms your immune system and makes you more susceptible to becoming sick. And then LSD is a hallucinogen that provides a visual trip, but there's a risk of panic. What's actually interesting is there are no long-term effects that we found associated with LSD. Which is somewhat surprising because I think we sort of think of it as, a bit intense or scary of a drug. But as it turns out, the science simply says that we haven't found any long-term side effects from using it thus far. And then really the same thing with THC. So THC is the active ingredient in marijuana, and THC is a mild hallucinogen. It can enhance your sensations, so that's, touch, taste, smell, etc. Relieve pain, it can distort time, it can promote relaxation. But what can be the negative side effects are impaired learning and memory and increased risk of psychological disorders. However, that's only the case if your brain is not fully developed. As it turns out, just like LSD, we have seen really no long-term health effects to using marijuana or THC. And what's interesting is we actually have found that it can somewhat affect your short-term memory. However, if you stop, that's only if you're like a really regular user of it, but even if you stop using it, it turns out that actually your short-term memory will repair itself, and so there are no permanent long-term health effects associated with using marijuana or THC. And then I also just want to mention, so under ecstasy and THC it says mild hallucinogen, whereas LSD is a full hallucinogen. The difference is this: mild hallucinogens cause hallucinations that are not visual. So you're never going to see something that isn't really there on ecstasy or on marijuana, THC. But what can happen is the hallucinations that you sort of get from that might be auditory hallucinations or increased sensations, so touch sensations, stuff like that. But LSD is the only one that's going to give you a visual hallucination, which is what makes it a full hallucinogen instead of just a mild hallucinogen. Okay, moving on to the end here. So, substance use disorder is a disorder characterized by continued substance craving. So, craving is the first component of a substance use disorder. And then the second component is you using it despite the fact that you are significantly disrupting your life or putting yourself at physical risk when you use the drug or substance. Tolerance is this idea that the more you use a drug, the more you need to use to get the same amount of high. And that's just because your body will build up, a tolerance to it, which is essentially just kind of your body gets used to it and therefore can work against it more and more, because it's not so much of a shock or a surprise to your system if you continually use something. And so as people use drugs more regularly, they have to use more and more in order to achieve the same effect as they did when they first started. The only drug that works in the opposite way is actually marijuana. We see that the more frequently people use marijuana, the more their tolerance actually goes down. which is super interesting. And that's largely because marijuana stays in your system for longer than other drugs. And so if you're using it frequently, you still have some in your system. And so when you use more of it, it just adds more on top of that. And therefore sort of acts in the opposite way. But all the other drugs are going to work in that way where, the more you use, the more you need to use in order to get the same effect. And then withdrawal is the discomfort and distress that follow discontinuing an addictive drug or behavior. Let me look at this list really quick. Every single one of these is going to have a withdrawal with the exception of LSD and THC. There is no withdrawal associated with stopping the use of LSD or with stopping the use of marijuana, THC. So, while someone very well could be psychologically addicted to LSD or THC, their body will not be physiologically dependent on it. So even if someone, smokes weed every single day for a year and then stops cold turkey, they may think in their mind that they're psychologically addicted and that they need to use it. But their body doesn't have that same response as it would to a physiologically addictive substance. And so actually you can stop marijuana cold turkey and have it not be a problem because your body is not dependent on the substance the way that it does become dependent on things like heroin or methamphetamine, etc. And then alcohol use disorder specifically is basically just substance use disorder, but specifically for alcohol. And this is marked by tolerance, withdrawal, and a drive to continue the use even though it's problematic. And so one thing that I actually want you to write down, either under 2 or 4 here, substance use or alcohol use disorder, is that using something a lot actually doesn't qualify it as being a disorder, even though we might think, if someone, smokes weed every single day, surely they're addicted. Surely that's a substance use disorder or something like that. But actually, using something really frequently, even drinking every day or using a drug every single day, is not what classifies it as a use disorder. What classifies something as being a use disorder is that you're using it even though it causes problems in your life. Whether those problems are, problems with your day-to-day life, like it interferes with your ability to work or to, successfully accomplish goals or something like that. Or if it's that it negatively impacts your health, the use is problematic because, it's causing you cancer or something like that. So using a drug or alcohol a lot does not make it a substance use disorder. What makes something a substance use disorder is the fact that it's causing problems in your life. It's disrupting your life or it's problematic in some way, and you continue to use it even though you're aware that it's problematic. Alrighty, well that's that. Make sure to turn in your pre-session worksheet before the Zoom session. And yeah, other than that, I will see you there.